Okay then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 161. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this is my beverage. And I know what some of you out there are thinking. You're thinking, oh, 161 might be a prime number. No, it's not. Grow up. So 161 is actually 7 times 23. So it's kind of semi-prime, I guess, sort of. But it's not. And we've got sort of like lower end of the average amount. You know, we got maybe 30 questions. So that's all right. That's fine. We don't want to stray into the extremes of too many or too few. And I might as well just wade into this. And the first question is from Siovak and Sipad Zirna, who has the special privilege of asking more than 3 questions this time, because sometimes it happens that someone will ask a question in the Discord server after I've already recorded the next Q&A, but before I put it up on the, like, in the Q&A room, so that sometimes I'll just scroll below the most recent Q&A to find the new questions. And this time, or last time, I failed to look just above the Q&A that was posted for questions that were asked after I collected the questions. No, after something. But is after I had recorded the Q&A, the previous one. But let's see. I don't know. I already explained it once. That should be good enough. As it turns out, he asked these questions right before the previous Q&A came up, and so it was above the most recent Q&A, and I didn't look above, I just looked below, assuming that all the new questions would be after the Q&A was posted, which was not the case. Just disregard everything that I just said because it is largely irrelevant. So, Siovak and Sipad Zirna says, does Hinduism have good morality? To me, Hinduism seems like a religion with no real morality beyond the caste system Dharma, and most of the morality in India comes from non-Hindu traditions like Buddhism, Jainism, or even the British forcing it onto the Hindus. Not saying Hindus can't be moral, but it seems to have no real significance on a spiritual level in itself, and is merely a social convention. For example, they see no problem in widow burning, treating low castes like subhumans, or sacrificing people to the goddess Kali, because at the end of the day, morality has nothing to do with spirituality. Correct me if I'm wrong, as I've heard similar claims about the ancient Greek pagans, but from my research that turned out to be incorrect, so I wonder how true it is here. So that's the first question. And my experience with Hindus, just kind of superficially, is that the one kind of morality that they seem to take very seriously is ahimsa. That ahimsa is taken seriously by Hindus, at least by mainstream Hindus. I mean, there's always going to be some people that just don't give a shit about morality, regardless of what religious system they grew up in. But I mean, in like Hindus, just going with my limited experience and my father's stories about working on ships with Hindu crews, and just, you know, what I've seen and heard, stereotypes, generalities, that sort of thing, is that Hindus will steal, I mean, not all of them, obviously, but it's common that, I mean, stealing anything that isn't nailed down. When I went to India, I had size 13 flip-flops that were all chewed up by rats from when I was in Thailand. You turn your back again, and they're not there anymore. What they want to do with size 13 rat-chewed flip-flops, I don't know. But I was going barefoot most of my pilgrimage to India, not out of religious sentiment, but because my flip-flops got stolen. Also, lying is considered to be like, it's like good manners in India, or that is my experience, where it's just considered to be polite to tell people what you think they want to hear, that sort of thing. With regard to, like, what is this, widow burning? I mean, that is supposedly voluntary on the part of the widow. There's not like people like throwing this struggling woman into the fire that I've ever heard of. So let's see here. Treating low castes like subhumans, well, Siovak and Sipad Zirna himself would seem to endorse that under certain circumstances. Since I believe I can recall him lamenting the decline of the Indian race, or rather the Indo-Aryan race, as it interbred with the indigenous, like, Dacia people, until, it's just no longer of like Indo-European caliber in certain respects. So I don't see why Siovak and Sipad Zidna would disapprove of treating low castes like subhumans. Sacrificing people to the goddess Kali. Yeah, there have been certain sects of Kali worshippers that would actually do human sacrifices. And also I have read, in fact, it was in a book called Where There Is No Doctor, the Indian version, where there's this stern warning that sacrificing a baby to Kali is not going to cause a woman to become fertile. Don't do that. It's not good. So I guess even nowadays that sometimes a baby will be, somebody else's baby will be sacrificed to Kali for the sake of the woman being able to conceive, that sort of thing. But I mean, you can find these kind of outliers in any kind of religious culture, including Buddhism. Not that there's like regular human sacrifices in Burma that I know of, but still, there's always going to be these outliers that most, like the average Hindu, wouldn't think of doing. So let's see here. The ahimsa, Siovak and Sipad Zirna says that most of the morality in India comes from non-Hindu traditions like Buddhism, and ahimsa is largely, like ahimsa in India, like in Hinduism, was largely inspired by Buddhism. The animal sacrifices came to an end largely because of the effects of Buddhism in Indian culture. But still, in India, like vegetarianism is common. At least not eating beef is fairly common. They do have like a respect for renunciation, that sort of thing. They'd still uphold like the renunciant ideal. But as I say, like with regard to the average person, it may be that the one main thing that they really consider to be of utmost importance is just not killing. So, there is that. From the Buddhist point of view, that's the most important precept to keep, is not killing, So, know what I'm saying? So, let's see. Even the British forcing it onto the Hindus. Just even like, well, where do I start with this? Originally, like the Vedic religion was similar to like European paganism. It came from the same source, at least much of it did. So there wasn't really a lot of morality involved. It was just sort of like propitiating the gods, offering sacrifices to the gods in return for sons, cattle, and victory over one's enemies, that sort of thing. But, any kind of culture is going to have some kind of, like moral ideals, at least even just like fearlessness, barbarian virtues, like just bravery, that kind of thing. That I'm not exactly sure how much emphasis on bravery there is in modern Hindus, but I assume there's some of that. Let's see. It seems to have no real spiritual level itself, is merely a social convention. Let's see. was this? He says, at the end of the day, morality has nothing to do with spirituality. I don't think so. It's like cultural conventions may not have much to do with spirituality, but morality certainly has, it's just like the elementary level of spirituality. Sila, Samadhi, Panya. According to Theravada Buddhism, you have to have pure morals before you can really get advancement in your meditation. And you have to have like pure samadhi, pure concentration before you can get enlightenment. So, yeah, I would niggle with that part. So, yeah, I do think like the main outstanding virtue of Hindus would be like not killing. They might steal and lie, that sort of thing. With regard to like sexual morality, I really don't know. And I think it has changed radically just over the past few decades, where, I mean, it used to be just a very patriarchal kind of a society. Women were like a girl was owned by her father, and then she would be passed off to her husband, who became her new owner. And then if her husband died, then her grown sons would essentially be her owner. That women were practically property in India up until fairly recently, because nowadays you hear about just Indian women also just being like what Instagram thoughts and stuff. So I really can't say what India is like exactly nowadays, or what Hindus are like exactly nowadays. But just based on like my experience in life, at the very least, they take ahimsa seriously. So I'm just going to move on to Siovak and Sipad Zirina's next question. Let's see here. Which is as follows. The Hindu gods like Shiva, Brahma, Vishnu, and Indra have vices like lust, or use tactics like rape through trickery to get their way in some texts. It doesn't seem Hinduism has an ideal of immoral purity in their tradition, at least from my limited understanding. You just don't want to get on some ascetic or god's bad side, or they will unleash their fury on you. Meanwhile, in Buddhism, the gods are seen as more morally pure in general, and the higher up you go in the cosmos, the more pure the beings become in their morality. What do you think this says about how these two different traditions view the world differently? Okay, well, one thing is, like I've already mentioned, like the early Vedic proto-Hinduism was similar to like ancient Greek and Roman paganism. And so, I mean, if you read ancient Greek and Roman stories about the gods, they do the same stuff. They have vices like lust and use tactics like rape through trickery, etc., etc. So in that respect, they come from a common tradition of like amoral gods. The gods don't have to worry about that sort of thing, since morality to like a prehistoric pagan or early historic pagan, morality is just like not pissing off the gods. You want the gods on your side instead of on the side of your enemies. So if there's like taboos, some god doesn't want you to eat beans, then you don't eat beans if you don't want that god to be displeased with you, that sort of thing. Like you want to be on the good side of Mars, the god of war. You don't drop your shield and run from the battlefield. But let's see. The Buddhists, it is true that the Buddhists have more moral deities, partly because their tradition isn't as old. So they don't have this baggage. It's like in like the late Roman Empire, like in the time of Julian the Apostate, when he's trying to like improve paganism so it can compete better with Christianity. I mean, he was saddled with all this baggage of all these poets coming up with all these tales of gods just behaving in this petty, vindictive, shitty way that, I mean, it just kind of like a ball and chain to trying to uplift the gods into morally superior beings. And Hinduism probably got stuck with some of that. In Buddhism, it was kind of a new tradition. And so even Saka, king of gods, he was like the he was like the patron deity of the Indo-Aryan invaders. You know, he's one of the main deities who's propitiated in the Vedas. You know, he was like the tribal deity of the Indo-Aryans. And they the Buddhists just took Indra, king of gods, who was like this swaggering, like war god practically, and turned him into a good Buddhist, changed his name, turned him into an Arya, like a Buddhist saint. And they could get away with that sort of stuff. You know, they're just coming up with a new tradition. They can just have like a more advanced concept of morally superior beings. So there's that too. But I mean, I would assume that like a lot of these tales of the Hindus, of like the gods and, you know, just all this head chopping and like Kali, you know, dripping, she got fangs dripping with blood and all that. It's like reinterpreted metaphorically. But there's also this one issue, especially with regard to Krishna, like in the Mahabharata and probably some of the, what do you call them? I can't remember the kind of literature that I'm trying to get at, but there's a lot of it regards Krishna, for example. And Krishna did all kinds of stuff. I mean, you know, he was not a moral person. He was like amoral in certain respects, even though he was like a personification, an avatar of to Vaishnava Hindus, the highest God, you know, the absolute capital G God. And in a sense, it makes sense because like I've said before, Krishna wasn't just the God of good. Krishna, or Vishnu, you know, Krishna as an avatar of Vishnu was the God of good and evil. He was the God of everything. And so he had to represent everything. Sort of like in Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun, where the Messiah figure, you know, the conciliator, the person who represents the human race, he starts off as a torturer. You know, he's just kind of born and raised into a guild of torturers, and he starts off as a torturer. Not because he chose that job, you know, didn't have a calling towards it. He was just kind of born into this guild and started off as a torturer. And it's like, in order to represent humanity, you have to represent all that humanity represents, that all that it brings to the table. And I think there is some wisdom in having Krishna, you know, like seducing the 500, you know, cowherd girls all at the same time, or, you know, stealing, or, you know, help participating in wars, that kind of thing. That it does make kind of sense. I mean, it's a more sophisticated view of some anthropomorphic capital G God than just God is absolutely good and he doesn't like evil, even though this universe that he created is just like overflowing with it. So it's like, to the pure man, all things are pure, as the Bible says. So, I mean, there is some of that in kind of the more sophisticated, like Hindu mythology. So, but then again, its roots go back into the same roots as the Greek and Roman pantheons, where the gods are essentially amoral, or, you know, they're just sort of glorified humans with glorified human vices, that kind of thing. So there's some of that too. So let's see here. Did I answer the question? I think so. Let's see. Or I guess the question is, what do you think this says about how these two different traditions view the world differently? Yeah, Buddhism, especially when it was just starting, you know, Vedism had already existed for over 1,000 years in the Buddhist time. So it was already ancient in the Buddhist time. And so, I mean, you can't change up these relics of like a much earlier time other than just reinterpreting things as metaphors and that sort of thing. Whereas Buddhism, it arose in the so-called axial age, where there was a more sophisticated understanding of, morality and how it is related to spirituality in general, that sort of thing. And so they could kind of start off and from a more sophisticated place than the Hindus did. But really, the culture was the same, that like Vedism and Buddhism, they coexisted for a long time. So, they viewed the world rather similarly from that point of view. And the Hindus had their own like renunciant ascetics and all that too. So Hinduism has a broader spectrum of what it represents. Buddhism is somewhat more narrow, especially the early Indian pre-Mahayana schools. They were kind of rather tightly focused on, like liberating oneself from samsara. It wasn't so much all this stuff about marriage and children and all this other stuff that the Vedic system was started in. So, gosh, where was I trying to go with that one? This is what happens when like some of the first questions get into heavy stuff, when I haven't really gotten my momentum going yet. But I think what this says about how these two different traditions view the world differently, the Buddhist view is much more focused on like liberation from suffering and samsaric delusion, whereas that's also contained in Hinduism. It's just that's just one aspect of this whole spectrum of stuff going on in Hinduism, because Hinduism was largely just Indian culture for a long time. There wasn't really much differentiation between just Vedic Brahmanism and just ancient North Indian culture. It was pretty much the same thing. So you got like the laws of Manu, that it's just like social codes, proper behavior. A Brahmin should never point with his finger at a pregnant cow, that kind of thing. So the way they view the world is fairly similar, although just the morals are different with regard to especially renunciation. Like a good Hindu should go through the different ashrama dharmas. He should start off as the celibate student, and then he should become the householder, raise a family, and then he renounces the world after his kids are grown and no longer dependent on him. Whereas in Buddhism, it's just renounce as soon as you can. That's like the main difference. Plus, certain philosophical differences that I don't know if I'm going to get into in this particular episode, because I'm moving on to the next question. Also from Siovac and Sipad Zirna. He says, thoughts on Ajahn Sona saying the Buddha was not just a mystic because he was able to be logical and lucid seems to make sense to me. Well, St. John of the Cross was able to be logical and lucid. Just because someone's a mystic doesn't mean that they're going to be like completely irrational. You can be a mystic and all sorts of other things. You can be a mystic and a scientist. Some people have managed that. So yeah, he wasn't just a mystic, but I do think that early Buddhism was primarily based on mysticism, and he used like his intelligence and his, pre-modern logic as a way of supporting that. So like Nagarjuna also, he had a more sophisticated, more advanced kind of logic, because he arose like 500 years after the time of the Buddha. And he's using all this complicated philosophy as a way of just sort of getting to mysticism. It's like, like Nagarjuna is famous for just setting up these syllogisms that just destroys all possibilities. There is no valid answer to any question. And so that just kind of like, he's using logic to destroy itself and leaving just silence and emptiness behind, which is the mystical aspect of it, because you cannot understand reality by thinking about it. The only way you can understand reality is just by just participating in it directly with no symbolic interpretation between you and reality. No trying to make sense of stuff, for example. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what Ajahn Sona would consider to be genuine teachings of the Buddha. I assume he'd be more orthodox than me and consider more of the Tipitaka to be genuine teachings of the Buddha, so that you're going to have like Vibhajavada. Sometimes in the suttas, Theravada is referred to as Vibhajavada, or the doctrine of analysis. And I really don't think the Buddha was analyzing much, other than perhaps as just like a tool or gimmick for getting to mysticism. So personally, I do not think that the Buddha was a Vibhajavadan, even though Theravada did become Vibhajavada, or the doctrine of analysis. Just like breaking things down into smaller parts, trying to single out causes and conditions and so forth, which Abhidhamma was dedicated to. I really don't think that that is what the Buddha had in mind when he was setting the wheel of Dharma in motion. So, yeah, he wasn't just a mystic. I don't think any mystic is just a mystic. So, I think I'm just going to move on to Siobakchan Sipat Zidna's fourth question, which is permitted because I omitted accidentally his 3 questions in the previous Q&A. So, he says, in the Kalaha Vivada Sutta, which I just recently did a video on, the video I uploaded right before this one was in my Studies in Archaic Buddhism series, and I focused on the Kalaha Vivada Sutta, the discourse on quarrels and contentions. But I just interrupted myself. I'll just return. I'll start asking the question again. Siobakchan Sipat Zirna says, in the Kalaha Vivada Sutta, I thought the Buddha would say parinibbana is better than Nibbana, like the Jains who say it's better than even an omniscient Tirthankara. I know you said a person who asks such a thing just doesn't get it, but I'm not satisfied with that explanation and need to dig deeper. I don't understand what the Buddha means in his answer, so having understood these to be dependent, the sage, an investigator, having understood the ways of dependence, a released one, having understood, does not come to contention, the wise one does not attain to this or that existence, quote unquote. Then Siobakchan Sipat Zina continues, from my understanding, what the Buddha is saying is that an arahant is not dependent on anything by not clinging to anything, and whether there are aggregates to cling to or not is irrelevant. Thus, there is no higher or lower states of conditions to them, since they no longer depend on any condition or lack of conditions. Whether the arahant is in parinibbana or alive in nibbana only is a difference to people who cling to the things that make them different and proliferate based on that. Thoughts? Yeah, I would agree with that. Plus, if you read the Atthakavagga, the dependence is dependence on anything, including knowledge. It's dependent on perceptions, dependent on views, dependent on knowledge. So you get rid of all that dependence. I mean, what distinction is there between Nibbana and parinibbana? You know, you get rid of the perception, and it's just utterly irrelevant. It doesn't even get up to the level of irrelevance. It's just blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, I mean, one of the main themes of the Atthakavagga is just do not depend on anything, including what you've seen, what you've heard, what you feel, you know, any view that you have, any philosophy. Don't be dependent on any of that. And when you get rid of all that dependence, all that's left is just liberation. And it doesn't matter, you know, what kind of conditions that an unenlightened person would apply to that liberation. That's just irrelevant. So maybe I answered that one. Yeah, you just said thoughts. So any thoughts that I emit that come out my mouth, I guess would be the answer to that question. Let's see here. Yeah, I think I'd pretty much agree with him, although I mean, it really, I mean, even just trying to explain it is already kind of muddying the waters in a way. Because from the enlightened point of view, I mean, it's just, you're not dependent on anything, including your own thoughts. So, I'm just going to move on to Siovakchen Sipat Zirna's fifth and last question for this episode. He says, another part of the same sutta, it says, quote, in stimulation are founded pleasant and unpleasant. In stimulation not being, they do not exist. Non-existent and existence too, whatever it means, I tell you that they are founded in this, unquote. And then Siovakchen Sipat Zirna continues here in the sutta saying that existence and non-existence are both founded in stimulation. Or no, he says, is the sutta saying that existence and non-existence are both founded in stimulation? Or is it saying that existence is founded in stimulation while non-existence is founded in non-stimulation? I'm bringing up the second interpretation because there are various suttas that describe Nibbana as the cessation of existence or being. And if this is the case, then fetters like bhavatana and vibhavatana would be seen as craving for aggregates continuing, or samsara, and aggregate ceasing, or parinibbana. Thus, this earlier part of the Kalaha Vivada Sutta might already be somewhat setting up for the later question about what state is higher. Well, if you read it literally, it seems to me that what he's saying is that both existence and non-existence are reliant upon pasa, or contact, or stimulation. So, I mean, the dichotomy, first is the dualistic dichotomy of existence and non-existence is a concept. I mean, people just really can't get this sort of thing, that existence and non-existence are just kind of a illusory concept. So it's like someone were to ask me if I believe in God, even if I were like a theist, I mean, still it would be like a trick question because God would transcend existence and non-existence. A capital G absolute God. Because existence and non-existence are both just concepts. I think the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, or the Yoga of Knowing the Mind and Its Nakedness, also brings up this point, that existence and non-existence are both just concepts of mind. And for someone who is just like stuck in perception, that makes no sense whatsoever. And really, reality makes no sense. And so people that insist on stuff making sense are essentially insisting on samsara. Because samsara is meaning. Samsara is perception. So let's see here. Yeah, let's see. Existence, bhavatana. Let's see. There was something in here I was going to touch on here. Existence founded in non-stimulation. I'm bringing up the second interpretation because there are various sutras that describe Nibbana as the cessation of existence or being. Yeah, well, that's bhava. And bhava in that case is essentially karma. It's like the force of existence. I usually translate bhava in that sense as the force of existence, which is like the karmic momentum of mental states that is just like pushing you forwards through samsara. So that would be somewhat different from like the difference between existence and non-existence. It's like the force of existence, which is, part of the main, it's like one of the main things that a Buddhist should be contending with or dealing with, is just the momentum of his own mental states. The momentum of his samsara. So, let's see, where's the question though? I don't know. Oh, here it is. Let's see, is it saying that existence is founded in stimulation while non-existence is founded in non-stimulation? I don't think so. I think that perception, or like stimulation, is kind of, it's like stimulus response theory. You have to have a stimulus before you can have a perception, or at least to have like an objective perception, and then you make judgments about, existing and non-existing and so forth. So yeah, I do think that the literal reading, which is sort of counterintuitive, but the literal reading of the sutta is that both existence and non-existence are founded in stimulation, or phassa in Pali, usually translated as contact. Although in this case, in most cases, I think phassa might be more correctly or accurately translated as stimulation. So, yeah, the duality of existence and non-existence is the response to a stimulus. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. And those answers may not make a lot of sense to like an intellectual who insists on everything being logically rigorous and making sense. But as I keep saying, sense is samsara. Sense is delusional. Meaning is delusional. Which, to like head-oriented people, like probably most of the people who watch my videos, I mean, that's just, how do you deal with that? Especially if you're not mystically oriented, where you're just kind of samsara, like mental samsara perception is all you've ever known, except for like when you're in the middle of a sneeze. You know, when you're in the middle of a sneeze, that's the closest that a lot of people get to enlightenment, in my opinion. Because you're wide awake and you're not thinking anything. But the thing is, it's so brief and it's just considered to be a kind of anomaly, so that generally, like, intellectuals will not try to integrate that experience into their worldview. You know, it's just like this anomaly caused by the sneeze. It doesn't matter. So I think I answered that question. I hope I did. Because I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Stellar Supreme. And this question also I missed in the previous Q&A. Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libra Lamb, occasionally still known as Libra Lamb, and by other names as well, furthermore besides. And he says, do you believe that a portion of the children being trafficked in the U.S. are being trafficked for the purpose of demonic sacrifice? It wouldn't surprise me. I would guess that the percentage would be less than 1% of the children being trafficked for the purpose of some kind of human sacrifice, not perpetrated by Hindus, I suspect, but by, I don't know, I don't even know if they'd be Satanists. It's just, there's like a satanic element to it, obviously. But I mean, to murder a baby, really, especially the baby that's already been born and is like wiggling and cooing and that sort of thing, to kill like someone who's totally innocent like that is very liminal. I mean, that is, you are disrupting the moral fabric of the universe by doing that, which then allows powers to come through, supposedly. And so there are some people who are willing to utilize those powers or attempt to utilize those powers to further their own career and to further like the political agenda of their group, that sort of thing. I assume that does happen. Not like a lot, but I assume it does happen. I was told by a jazz musician from St. Louis that in order to make it big in the music industry, you've got to like, what is the deity? Baphomet. You have to like worship Baphomet, which includes certain atrocities that are like disrupting the moral fabric of the universe, so that the power of Baphomet, I assume, can come through into this world. That kind of thing. But I think most of the children being trafficked in the U.S., I mean, most of it is just, you know, sending illegal alien children to supposed family members. You know, it's probably, you know, not that big of a deal in those cases. Sometimes it's like slavery. Sometimes it's sex slavery. And that would probably be above 1% with regard to like illegal alien children being trafficked into the United States. I would guess more than 1% of them are becoming like sex slaves. And I did see a little bit of news about how the Trump administration has located several thousand of the many thousands of children that went missing. And some of them were, in fact, sex slaves. Some of them were just plain old, like, work slaves. You know, some of them were dead. But there are certain factions in American society and politics and in European society and politics that just don't care about this sort of thing. It's just an embarrassment. Their side is responsible. They just want to sweep it under the rug and fake some outrage about some supposed atrocity perpetrated by the other side. So I'm just going to move on to Stella Supreme, formerly known as Libra Lamb, etc. Next question. Is your decision to not meditate, actually be not to meditate, motivated by a sense that the meditation now would not be as potent as the meditation you were doing as a monk? Yeah, that's the main reason. Is that, I mean, it was like, I got into some relatively deep meditative states as a monk, and then it kind of tapered off. And I mean, now, if I were to sit down and meditate, you know, I might have some lucid moments and so forth, but I don't see how it could compare with when I was a monk. It's like, you know, going back to the ABCs, and it's just not satisfying. I got as far as I could with it, so it's time to just do something else. So, let's see. Did I answer that question? Yeah, I mean, that is essentially it. Yeah, it's like the meditation I would do now as a layperson with a job and a mate and bills to pay and 3 dogs, etc., that it just would not do justice to the meditation I was doing as a monk, especially when my meditation was at its peak, like between the years 1999 and 2005. That was when my meditation was at its best. So that even when I was still a monk after that, it just, you know, it was just kind of stagnating. My meditation was not improving. It was, if anything, getting worse. And it was sort of like being the Red Queen in Wonderland, where she had to run as fast as she could just to stay in the same place. It's sort of like treading water. You know, you just keep grinding away at it, grinding, just to lose ground as slowly as possible. That sort of thing. So I've moved on, and I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Cherzaskaziz. And Cherzaskaziz says, are you ever jealous? I mean, after 30 years of training as a monk, not when you was young. So am I jealous? I mean, you can interpret jealous in 2 different ways. I mean, it could be sexual jealousy, or it could just be, you know, jealous of, you know, some person at work who, you know, gets commended, you know, is that kind of jealousy, you know, like envy or resentment of other people doing well, that kind of thing. I mean, being a human, I mean, there can be just little twinges of it that arise just kind of through human instinct or something, but I mean, it's not taken seriously. And with regard to sexual jealousy, I trust my woman. You know, I know that she's not messing around, has no intention of messing around behind my back. So, yeah, I mean, we don't go out much. Neither one of us is particularly social. But, I mean, if we went to, like, a cocktail lounge or something, and some guy is chatting her up, and they're just kind of, like, laughing and talking and ignoring me, if that were to ever happen, it hasn't thus far, but if it were to ever happen, I probably wouldn't like it much. You know, I'd start getting a little bit of irritation from that. But that situation just hasn't arisen. And I mean, I trust her more than she trusts me, I guess, just because I'm a more trusting person by nature, I think. So, yeah, I mean, if there is any kind of jealousy that I experience, it's just like little, like, initial twinges that are then dismissed. And I'm just going to move on to Cherzaska's next question, which is, do you think something like collective species memory exists? Well, from a biological point of view, a collective species memory would be ingrained into instinct. So it's like a frog has this instinct that if it gets caught by a snake, it should inflate itself and start squealing. Inflating it makes it harder to swallow, and squealing attracts larger predators that might be more interested in the snake than in the frog. And over, who knows how many hundreds of thousands or millions of years, that there has been like a certain amount of success. A frog is more likely to survive if it inflates and starts squealing when caught by a snake. If it's caught by a bird, my experience is they don't inflate or squeal. When they're caught by a human, as a general rule, they don't inflate or squeal. But when they're caught by a snake, that is just default what they do. And so in a way, that's kind of a collective species memory. If you're caught by a snake, inflate and squeal. And it's just built in to their psychology, frog psychology. So from a biological point, the collective species memory would be instinct of that the instincts of that species. With regard to something more metaphysical than that, then I don't know, it's possible. I don't know how you could prove it or disprove it or quantify it or measure it. So it wouldn't really be scientific. And I mean, I'm open-minded with regard to that sort of thing, but I think just the idea of animal instinct, the instincts of a species are like, in a way, at least to some extent, the collective species memory, at least a kind of collective species memory. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Terzaskazes, and he says, do you think after you die, you'll go to heaven realms? And I really don't know. I don't even think about that. I don't really even like to think about that sort of thing. What's going to happen to me after I die? Whatever is appropriate is going to happen. And I just take consolation in that. It's like whatever ought to happen is what's going to happen. And so I don't really think about, am I going to go to heaven? Am I going to be born as a human again? That sort of thing. I just don't think about it much, if at all. I remember before I became a monk, I was starting to think if there is such a thing as hell, I might be going there, which kind of helped spur me on to renounce the world. But I just really don't think about it. I mean, I suspect that, my spirit will continue to exist after I die, but I mean, I don't really have hopes about that sort of thing. It's like when I was in school many years ago, after I took a test, it was like I wouldn't worry, did I get an A? Did I do well on the test? It's like I wouldn't even think about it. And then that was the best attitude to take. It's not like you've got any kind of like anxiety or worry or anything that's creating bad karma that's then going to maybe make it more likely that you didn't do well on the test retroactively somehow. So yeah, I'm just content that whatever happens to me after I die is what ought to happen. Everything happens the way it's supposed to happen. And so like wanting or just wondering, that kind of thing, I just, for some reason, I just don't really go there. So, I mean, there's a chance of it, I guess. But I mean, if it's more appropriate for me to be reborn as a human, then I'm fine with that too. Whatever's going to help me to work out my karma or whatever it is. So, let's see. I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, a couple of Q&As ago, you speculated that Adi Shankaracharya might have contributed to Buddhism's decline in India by putting a Hindu spin on Buddhism with his Advaita Vedanta spirituality. As far as I can tell, the main distinction between the two is that in Vedanta, there does exist a self that is immutable and eternal, as opposed to Buddhism's concept of anatta, where there is no self. Can you further break down the similarities and differences between Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta? Well, I'm no authority on Advaita Vedanta. I've read the principal Upanishads, and I've read some of Shankara's commentaries, and I've read like learned articles and book chapters about Shankara, that sort of thing. Most of it long, long ago. So I do think there is one other difference between Buddhism and, the more philosophical schools of Hinduism, is that in Hinduism, they have this concept of samsara or maya as lila. It's like deva lila. It's just divine play. It's like Shiva doing this dance or whatever. And definitely in Buddhism, it's not seen that way, that it is just seen as just sort of like primordial ignorance and delusion is causing samsara. It's not some god like Vishnu lying on a lotus flower in the cosmos somewhere, dreaming this universe, which is one of the kind of mythological interpretations of this world that you find in Hinduism. So I'm not 100% sure that Vedanta would adopt this, Maya being like a divine projection rather than just ignorance and delusion. But that is one difference that has really struck me between at least some Hindu philosophies and Theravada Buddhism. But with regard to, let's see, like further breaking down similarities and differences between Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. Well, I mean, the similarities are like, it's fairly similar. I mean, they both believe in like karma, rebirth. There's an absolute, although in Buddhism, there's this wise, like, reluctance to reify the absolute. You're better to refer to the absolute as just empty, sunya, shunya, and leave it at that. It's what you should be working towards. It's good. It's like the goal, but trying to form a concept of it is just a fool's errand. It's going to be an exercise in futility. And so, I mean, I think Buddhism has adopted the wiser course than Vedanta, which is reifying the absolute, and at the same time reifying the self, which is just the same. Atman is Brahman. I mean, that's one of the main teachings in the Upanishads, is that your soul and God are the same. That your soul is just, the aspect of God that happens to be, in the center of you. And I think that Christianity would have really benefited from that interpretation also, but they went in a different direction. And I'm just making sure we are recording, because it's getting up close to an hour. The little green bars are going back and forth, which is good because it means the microphone is working. So yeah, it was like Advaita Vedanta, and especially like Madhyamaka Mahayana Buddhism, they became very similar with regard to their metaphysics. There's going to be some trappings that are different. There's not going to be an emphasis on Buddhas in Vedanta. There's going to be more of an emphasis on like Upanishadic sages, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, aside from reifying the absolute, and by the same token reifying the self, and just having this different concept of like Maya, what is the cause of samsara? There's some maybe subtle differences there. They are fairly similar. And I have said before that if I weren't a Buddhist, I'd probably be a Vedantist, just because they are like very philosophically sophisticated and like satisfying. Not fully satisfying, because nothing is fully satisfying, but still, I mean, I could embrace that much more easily than I can embrace Christianity, for example. That some Hebrew carpenter turned miracle rabbi who lived in the early Roman Empire died for my sins as the only begotten son of God Almighty, who is this being who gets pissed off regularly, etc., etc. Yeah, it's just Advaita Vedanta would be my second choice after Buddhism, I'm pretty sure. Anyways, I guess I'm just going to move on to Romeo's next question, which is, did you ever explore Vedanta spirituality yourself? And if so, what did you like or dislike about it? Well, like I said, I have read the principal Upanishads and read about Vedanta and so forth. I never really investigated like Vedantist monasticism. I know there is Vedantist monasticism. There are like Vedantist ashrams and monasteries with Vedantist monks. And I knew a person who had been a Vedantist monk, just like an internet acquaintance. And he really didn't divulge very much of what it was like. But I assume it would be fairly similar to being a Buddhist monk, just sort of like the external trappings would be different. Some of them. But I mean, both originated in ancient northern India. So, I mean, there's going to be a lot of similarities also. So, yeah, I mean, I really don't know that much about like Vedantist monastic practice, like the actual practice of it. I just know the theory. I do not know the practice of Vedanta, other than I'm sure they've got like yogic techniques and meditation and so forth. I just don't know exactly what kind they are. So what do I like about it? Well, I already said that, if I weren't a Buddhist, there's a good chance I would have chosen to be a Vedantist. So, I mean, I like the philosophical, I'm saying sophisticated or sophistication a lot in this episode. This can be like the sophistication episode. And yeah, so I guess I already answered it. Let's see. Did you ever explore Vedanta spirituality yourself? And if so, what did you like or dislike about it? Yeah, I didn't really explore any of the actual practice of Vedantic spirituality. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's third question, which is, are there any other spiritual traditions besides Vedanta that are similar to Buddhism? Well, of course, Jainism, it also arose in ancient North India, and it has roots going back into what I would assume is probably like the Shramana tradition, which originated in like the Indus Valley civilization or thereabouts. It was like an indigenous tradition that presumably existed before the Indo-Aryan invasion around 1500 BCE. So Jainism, yoga, but yeah, I guess yoga is different from Vedanta. So there are certain schools of Hinduism besides Vedanta that do have some like spiritual sophistication and philosophical sophistication. So yeah, yoga, which originated also in the Shramana traditions of ancient India. It was called Sankhya. And then some of the Sankhya philosophers, for whatever reasons, they agreed to accept the Vedas as authoritative, and they were absorbed into Hinduism. And so yoga is now considered to be a kind of Hinduism, but originally it was not. You just got two kinds of yoga, or two kinds of Sankhya now. You've got atheistic Sankhya, which I assume still exists in some kind of vestigial form in India. And then you've got theistic Sankhya, which is yoga, which is absorbed into Hinduism. So there's that also. Other spiritual traditions between Vedanta that are similar. I mean, the higher you go, the more the systems converge. Like the higher you go into like mysticism, like advanced mysticism, you can have Roman Catholicism getting close to Buddhism, like really advanced Catholicism and really advanced Buddhism. I mean, they're converging towards the top of the mountain. So a lot of the stuff that St. John of the Cross says is profound, and he came up with ideas similar to Buddhism. Even just the idea that like someone who has reached the stage of perfection, which before reading St. John of the Cross, I mean, I just wasn't expecting that in Christianity. I mean, Christianity It's like nobody is worthy of heaven. It's just by God's grace. Even Jesus himself in the New Testament, like somebody calls him good sir or good teacher, and he says, what do you call me good? There's none good except God. So that even Jesus apparently was denying being perfect. Whereas, and then St. John of the Cross comes along and says there is a stage of perfection. There's 3 stages. You've got the stage of the beginner or the common worldling, the putujana in Buddhism. You've got the stage of the adept, who is anyone who has mastered contemplation, like at least second jhana from the Buddhist point of view. Anyone who's mastered at least second jhana would be considered an adept by St. John of the Cross. And then you've got the perfect. And the perfect is someone who is no longer acting on their own self-will. They have mortified their self-will. And so they become like this divine puppet. They're motivated by the will of God. But I mean, that is very parallel to the Buddhist idea that an arhat creates no karma, because karma is will. So St. John of the Cross and the Buddhists, apparently independently of each other, came up with this idea that an enlightened being, someone who's reached the highest stage that a human can reach, is no longer has any will. Not of their own, which is interesting. So it's like you get into spiritual traditions, and at the lower levels, they can be radically different from each other. But you get higher and higher and higher, they're just all converging at the tip of the mountain, so to speak. So even in Islam, you've got like Sufis that I wouldn't be surprised if there have been enlightened Sufi masters. And like enlightened beings, they might disagree with some of the really fun, like the basic, like surface stuff, the superficial stuff, the cultural stuff. But when you get up like into the ethereal realms, they just agree more and more and more. It's just that some religious systems really don't have that capacity. Like the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. I mean, they have no concept of enlightenment. They have no concept of like jhana or high contemplation, anything like that. They're just trying to be good boys and girls so that God will let them live in paradise after they die. And that's the way most religions are at just like the mass cultural level. And so I guess I'd better just move on to the next question. This is from Frater Oculus, or Brother I. And Brother I says, how regularly does the beard need rebraiding? Yeah, that's right here. I got a braided beard in case you didn't notice. And in general, I go like every 2 days. And the second day, after I've already taken a shower, it gets pretty rough. I think technically they're called sticky outies, hairs that are kind of like, I got like this nimbus of loose hairs that are coming loose from the braid on day 2, which is good enough for going to work. It was good enough as far as I was concerned to do this video, but my woman didn't like that. She wanted to rebraid it for me, so I let her do that. So it's looking kind of neat now, but just a few hours ago there was like the sticky outies that was just kind of broken loose. They had liberated themselves from the braid. But I wouldn't go more than 2 days. It's like every other day at minimum for rebraiding it. But it's easy because I just present my beloved woman with a little rubber band and say, here. And it takes all of about a minute and a half for her to braid it for me. It's way easier than for me to braid it myself. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Alba Cochina. And Alba Cochina says, what are your thoughts on Sri Dharma Pravartaka Acharya from Dharma Nation? And I have watched several of his videos. In fact, I remember when I was still a monk, somebody told me that I was like the Buddhist version of him, which after watching his videos, I really don't see it. I really don't think that as a monk, I was like the Buddhist version of him. I mean, both of us are kind of based with regard to sort of more or less right-wing politics, at least non-leftist politics. I mean, you could be like a complete centrist classical liberal and still be considered like a fascist and a Nazi by postmodern standards. But I mean, I think it's kind of interesting watching his videos, but I do consider him to be very dogmatic. You know, he will just state like Hindu Sanatana dharmic arguments or doctrines as just gospel truth. I mean, a lot of it he couldn't possibly know from his own experience, but he just asserts that it's true, period. And I mean, I really don't swing that way. I'm not that dogmatic. So I mean, I'm sure he's a good man, and you know, I wish him nothing but the best. But I do think that he is rather dogmatic. You know, that he is just conveying as gospel truths, like stuff that he doesn't really know if it's true or not. He just firmly believes it because of faith. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Aurochs, an extinct kind of cattle. And Aurochs says, how doesn't Buddhism fall into some kind of meaningless nihilism when there is no self and reality is ultimately an illusion? Who is understanding the Buddhist truth about the nature of this reality if there is no self? And how can it be true if this knowledge is a part of an illusory reality? So I think there's more than one question mark. So I guess that counts as more than one question. I'm just going to divide it up. So I'm just going to go up to the first question mark and stop for the first answer. So he says, how doesn't Buddhism fall into some kind of meaningless nihilism when there is no self and reality is ultimately an illusion? Well, reality is not ultimately an illusion. I mean, that's just a contradiction in terms. How could reality be an illusion other than the illusion has some basis in reality? Just like you can say a mirage. I mean, it's not pure illusion because there is some kind of empirical basis to, you know, the shimmering appearance of a body of water in the distance in the desert, so to speak. You know, it's caused by like light refracted by heat and so forth that causes you to see something that's way off in the distance, or like a lot of water mirages, like on a hot day, you're driving down the highway and you can see like the shimmering surface of something that looks like a water in a dip in the road. And then when you get closer, it disappears, that sort of thing. But it's not pure illusion because there is some basis to that illusion. There is something real causing the illusion, you know, at least from the scientific point of view. So, I mean, reality can't ultimately be an illusion because then it wouldn't be reality. How can reality be an illusion? Unless, again, you're just talking about the fundamental essence of the illusion, you know, of the mirage or the dream or whatever it is. So, reality is reality. It's just that you can't understand it intellectually. You cannot know it perceptually. You have to transcend the limitations of your own human ape primate mental states in order to get to the reality. It's like Immanuel Kant. I mean, he believed that there is a reality, but we can't know it. All we can know is the illusion. I mean, Kant, I don't know if anyone called him a nihilist. You know, he did acknowledge that there is the thing in itself. It's just that we can't possibly know it. But in Buddhism, you can know it. You can know at least one Kantian thing in itself, and that is the Kantian thing in itself of your own consciousness. Without the intermediary of perception. Because if you try to perceive consciousness, it's not pure consciousness anymore, it's perception. And the perception is sort of like the mirage. You know, it's like if you get down to the nuts and bolts of that mirage, what is actually causing it, you get down to pure consciousness. But with regard to no self, I mean, so what? I guess with regard to the no self, I might be able to answer that better in the second part. But Buddhism doesn't fall into meaningless nihilism. I mean, nihilism would be like nothing is true. And that's not what Buddhism teaches. It's just that nothing that you can think is ultimately true and valid. If you want to know the highest truth, You have to experience it directly. And that would be like Nibbana or Nirvana. But you're not going to get there by thinking about it, unless maybe you're an Abhidhamma scholar. The Abhidhamma scholars, they really took the wrong ball and just ran in the wrong direction with it, in my opinion. They think, like in Burma, the Abhidhamma scholars think that they know ultimate reality because they have memorized the dogmas in these Abhidhamma books. And so their head is just full of these beliefs, and they're no closer to reality than they were before, probably. Unless they just do a lot of meditation and they get closer to reality in spite of all this dogma that they've been ingesting for decades and decades. But like I was saying, I mean, meaning is delusion. Meaning is samsara. So, I mean, I guess to some degree, Buddhism at the highest level falls into some kind of meaninglessness, because meaning is delusional. Meaning is perception. You take away perception, you take away meaning. That meaning is just symbols representing or attempting to represent something else. So, I guess I can just go on to the second question, which will help me to answer the first question. So maybe it was a mistake to have separated them, even though there's two different question marks here. He says, who is understanding the Buddhist truth about the nature of this reality if there is no self? Okay, let's just stop there. He's got a comma after this, but that's a good stopping point. Who is understanding the Buddhist truth about the nature of this reality if there is no self? There is no who. I mean, going with Orthodox Theravada, there is no self, but there's still mental states. So, I mean, even Western philosophers like even a worldly kind of Western philosopher like, what's his name? Bertrand Russell. I mean, he pointed out, like with regard to Descartes, that, I mean, the cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, is just bad reasoning, because there's no logical necessity for there to be a self in order for there to be thoughts. Even Bertrand Russell, I mean, this worldly Western philosopher, he was saying that, I mean, there is no logical necessity that there has to be a self in order to have thoughts. You know, it'd be more correct if Descartes had just said, there are thoughts. That would have come closer to the truth than I think, therefore I am. So, I mean, you can have thoughts, you can have mental states without there being an ultimately real self. I mean, ultimately, the mental states themselves are questionable. But still, logically, there is no need for there to be a self in order for there to be perceptions or thoughts. That the thoughts and the perceptions can exist just due to conditions. There doesn't have to be this real self generating these thoughts. The thoughts just arise according to conditions. And David Hume is another Western philosopher who came up with something along the lines of anatta in his magnum opus that he wrote in his 20s, where, you know, there is no self that you can really pinpoint. I mean, there's mental states, obviously, but the self that is supposedly like the vessel of these mental states is not apparent at all. You can't point to it. You can't prove that it exists. So, who is understanding the Buddhist truth about the nature of this reality if there is no self? No, there is no who. The understanding can just arise due to conditions, but it does not logically necessitate a self to be the owner of these mental states or the generator of these mental states. And then he continues, Alrox continues, and how can it be true if this knowledge is a part of an illusory reality? Well, again, illusory reality is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. I mean, the illusion can have a foundation or basis in reality, and then you would understand that. So you'd see through the illusion in order to get to the reality. So how can it be true if this knowledge is a part of an illusory reality? What any kind of like conceptual understanding is going to be like illusory to some degree. I mean, it's just going to be illusory. I mean, if you're trying to make sense of reality, then that's going to be illusory, because the reality cannot be made sense of. I mean, you cannot like intellectually understand ultimate reality, because you're just turning it into symbols. And as I keep saying, a symbol is radically different from what it attempts to represent. Like TREE on a piece of paper is radically different from an actual tree. Or any kind of understanding of a tree is radically different from that tree. They're just worlds apart, essentially. So we're dealing with illusion. That's what we've got to deal with, because we're stuck in it. We're stuck in samsara. And there is some Mahayana text, I think it's a Cardinal Mahayana Sutra, that says something like, the purpose of Lord Buddha's teaching is to liberate us from our thinking by means of our thinking. So it's like fighting fire with fire. You know, you're using skillful means. So you're taking your delusion and using it in a kind of somewhat less diluted manner to kind of like dilute itself down, to get weaker and weaker until finally you can break free from it. And then you're in reality, the Kantian thing in itself. So Buddhism could fall into some kind of meaningless nihilism to someone who is just absolutely addicted to their own thoughts and just cannot, I mean, they cannot accept that there could be anything that lies beyond the scope of their own intellectuality, their own perceptions. So Buddhism can be called a kind of meaningless nihilism to people that really don't get mysticism, that they're completely like addicted to thinking, they're just completely trapped in their own head, that kind of thing. But they don't really understand Dhamma, at least they don't understand the higher levels of it. They can only be understood through practice and personal direct experience. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, are clouds mandalas? A cloud is a mandala only if the person looking at the cloud decides to interpret it as a mandala. That's it. So clouds are not some sort of metaphysical symbols. They just arise due to conditions. And then somebody down on the ground, probably a new age type person, looks up and says, ooh, it's a mandala. But it's, and probably they mispronounce it as mandala. I guess as an English word, it might be correctly pronounced mandala. Although mandala is a Pali word. And I think it just means like it can mean like a circle, although like a large panel on a monk's robes. And monk's robes, like a Theravada Buddhist monk's robes, are cut up into big rectangles and small rectangles. And the large rectangles are called mandalas. The small rectangles are called Adha mandalas, which is a half mandala. So it's just like a large square would be like the meaning of mandala, at least in one sense in Pali. But, you know, the kind of symbolic meditation subject or object, it's just, you could just sort of artificially impose mandala-hood onto a cloud. But that's as far as it goes. And I'm going to move on to Philalethes' second question. Is imagination a kusala? And a kusala literally means unskillful, and sometimes it's translated as unwholesome. You know, it's bad karma. So is imagination bad karma? Well, if you're wallowing in it, yeah. Like an enlightened being, arguably, I mean, you don't really want to make like definitive statements about the mental states of an enlightened being, but an enlightened being probably has thoughts, you know, at least from like the empirical point of view. You could do like a PET scan on a fully enlightened being, assuming that fully enlightened beings even mean anything in a samsaric context, and there's probably activity going on in the brain, like thinking and so forth. It's just that when you're enlightened, I mean, you just don't identify with it anymore. You have transcended it. So it's still there. You just transcend it. It's not like you annihilate it. It's still there. It's just that you're no longer identified with it. You're no longer led astray by it. It's just nature taking its course. So the wiser you are, and the less you're just wallowing in imagination, the less akusala it is. But if you're just like Walter Mitty, some of you might know who Walter Mitty is. You know, there's this story by, I think it's James Thurber, wrote this like back in the 1940s or something. This guy named Walter Mitty, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. And he's just fantasizing about being this hero just in various, I mean, just throughout the day. He's just this inept boob who's completely henpecked by his wife, who's always on his case because he keeps messing things up. But he's just living in this imaginary world where he's like James Bond, you know? So, I mean, that kind of imagination, I mean, it can go even farther than that until you're just like psychotic, just living completely in this imaginary world that doesn't really vibe or correspond with what's going on in the empirical world for most people. So, yeah, the more wise the imagination gets, the more you're not attached to it and the less akusala it is. But really, if you're not enlightened, and you're thinking about stuff and believing that they're real, even like in a different context, then still there's at least a certain amount of delusion and thus a certain amount of akusala, because anything that is motivated by greed, hate, or delusion, attraction, aversion, or semi-conscious stupidity is going to have an element of akusala in it. Bad karma. Buddhism is just very fine-tuned, possibly the most finely tuned ethical system known to man. Because it's not just you just do what the God says and you're doing good. You go against what the God says and you're doing bad. It's like entirely psychological, so that any delusion that is like, what's the term? Like infusing your thoughts. And it's like all thoughts have at least illusion backing them up. So long as you're not enlightened, that just about anything that you think or do is going to have a certain amount of unskillfulness involved. And it's like imagination is just, to some degree, it's creating sort of a miniature world. You know, it's like you're watching a movie too. It's like you're watching a movie, a part of you is assuming that movie is real. You know, if you're not following along with the story and at least kind of semi like suspending disbelief, then I mean it's just pointless. Why watch the movie? I mean you could be like a movie critic who's just watching how good of an acting job the actors are doing, or like trying to like deconstruct the plot lines and this kind of thing. I mean, that would be kind of like what a Buddhist ascetic is doing to everyday life to some degree. But still, most people, they're reading a story, they're watching a movie, they're just daydreaming and coming up with some scenario, having a dream at night. And, you know, at least part of you is assuming that is real, which is delusional. I mean, you wouldn't get excited you're watching a scary movie if at least part of your mind wasn't assuming that it was real. So, yeah, is imagination akusala? Not necessarily, but usually, and for just about any unenlightened being, it's got at least a little bit. And the more attached to it you are, the more you're wallowing in it, the more akusala it's going to be. Especially if you're fantasizing about like killing your boss or something, then yeah, that would be even worse. If you're just fantasizing about being a rock star or something, it might not be as bad as fantasizing about being someone who's blowing up entire cities. I'm just going to move on to Phil Lathy's third question. He says, are there infinite ways to practice Dhamma? Theoretically, yeah, there'd be infinite ways to practice Dhamma, in theory. But, yeah, I don't know if there have been infinite ways that Dhamma has been practiced in this world, because there have only been a finite number of people who have practiced Dhamma in this world. It might be a very high number, hundreds of millions, maybe even a billion or so, over the millennia, but still you haven't gone up into infinite numbers. So it'd be theoretically yes. And maybe if you consider the entire universe, all the possible worlds in all the possible realms, then yeah, we might be up to an infinite number. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from someone whose name looks like it should be pronounced Kriel, but is actually pronounced Throat Warbler Mangrove. And Throat Warbler Mangrove says, why did the Buddha not allow women in the Sangha initially? Is it related to the fact that women, in Throat Warbler Mangrove's opinion, in general bring drama, need attention, are emotional, nag, and play victim more than men? Why their inclusion in the Sangha caused Buddhism to survive less, according to Buddha? Well, that's kind of politically incorrect, isn't it? To ask such a question. So, the Buddha, being male, in a male-dominated society like almost all societies were, up until relatively recently, he started the Sangha for men, for monks. And there were some female ascetics. There were some sects, some ancient Indian schools that did allow female ascetics. And I think the main reason why the Buddha was reluctant to ordain nuns is just that when you have monks and nuns interacting with each other, scandal inevitably arises. Not from every monk and every nun, of course, but the chances are you got a monastery of celibate, sexually frustrated men, and you've got a convent, like just right next door maybe, of celibate, sexually frustrated women. Nature is going to take its course sooner or later. It's going to result in scandal, which is going to bring disrepute onto the Sangha. So I assume that was the main reason why the monk did not want to ordain nuns. Also, there's like one reason that you can find in the texts. You might take a little bit of reading between the lines, but it's fairly obvious that some women, like according to the texts, after the Buddha finally allowed bhikkhunis or Buddhist nuns to be ordained, there were women who were just getting away from bad marriages. They're just like escaping from an asshole husband by becoming nuns. And they did not have like a real vocation. They didn't really, they didn't have a spiritual calling. They're just trying to get away from some jerk that their parents like betrothed her to when she was a baby. And, that happened. So it apparently was a thing, even in the Buddhist time, that some women that wanted to become nuns really were just trying to get away from a bad family situation. And so, there's possibly some of that involved also. According to the text, the Buddha did get talked into ordaining nuns by his cousin Ananda, who was also his personal attendant at the time, by Ananda saying, well, can't women become enlightened just like men can? And the Buddha had to admit, yes, actually, women can become enlightened. So reluctantly, he said, all right, I'll ordain nuns, but now you've done it because the Sangha is only going to last half as long now. The true Dhamma will exist in this world for only 500 years instead of 1,000 because of ordaining nuns. And probably, again, it's just biology that men and women, sexually frustrated celibate men and women who are interacting with each other, it just breeds scandal. It's just natural human nature. It's just the way it is. We are human. Even monks and nuns are human. They still have all those animal instincts that are called human nature in our species. So, even a celibate monk, he sees a pretty woman, it's like the pupils dilate, so, ooh, it's just the way it is. And so probably it was best, in the Buddha's opinion, at first, just have men. It's going to be kind of like a fringe thing for women anyway. There's not going to be nearly as many nuns as there are monks anyway. And so best to just keep the men by themselves without these, possible temptations interacting with them all the time. So, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Samana. And Samana says, I know you are not confident in the authenticity of Sotapanna and Sakadagami levels, or Anagami for that matter. But let's say you changed your mind or really have to try to advance or advocate that Sotapanna and Sakadagami are the real Buddhist teachings and people really do reach this Aryan level. How would you explain it? Please, please try hard to advocate it. I'm not exactly sure what Samana wants me to do here. I mean, I could just say what tradition says. It's like you've got kind of like St. John of the Cross was talked about. You got three levels. You've got the Putujana, the common worldling. Then you've got the Seika, which is the person in training, which is, from going with Theravada interpretation, the lower three levels of Buddhist sainthood or ariya-hood, Sotapanna, Sakadagami, and Anagami. And then you've got the Aseika, the one no longer in training, who is fully enlightened. That would correspond to St. John of the Cross's stage of perfection. And that is fairly acceptable to me. But when you divide the Seika into three categories, where the Sotapanna is someone who can't break any of the five precepts. I mean, even if, for any reason, they're just incapable of it. And they are going to be born no more than 7 times, I think. See, I really have never really taken it very seriously. So I'm not even sure exactly what are the exact specifications for a Sotapanna and a Sakadagami. But the Sotapanna, I'm pretty sure it's no more than 7 more rebirths before, it's like you have reached the point of no return. There's no relapsing back into lower realms. You won't be born in hell or as an animal or a ghost, anything like that. And so you're going to be at least human level for no more than 7 lives before you become enlightened. And you have this flash of insight, which is like the first little glimpse of Nibbana. And, it's like, that's it. Point of no return. You can no longer tell lies or any such thing. And that's like the official doctrine. There's certain fetters and hindrances that are cut off. You don't have doubt. You don't have self-view anymore, that kind of thing. Then the Sakadagami is you have 1 more human life maximum before you're enlightened. And then some of the other hindrances or fetters become like attenuated. And really it strikes me as largely arbitrary, like this Sakadagami distinction. And it's not mentioned at all in what are considered to be older texts, but I'm supposed to be advocating hard for it. So, my advocating hard for it is like, well, there have been lots and lots of wise teachers, and in the text, the Buddha himself advocated for it. So who am I to be skeptical? And then the Anagami, which in like the first suttas of the Iti-Vuttaka, apparently Anagami is used as a synonym for enlightenment, which makes sense. Non-returner, you're not coming back. Just intuitively, if you came across that term, you would assume that it means an enlightened being. But an Anagami is someone who's going to be, they're not going to be reborn on this planet anymore. They're going to spend one last life up in some very advanced heaven realm. The divine abodes, the happy realms. And only good Buddhist saints can get up there. Which is why the Hindus never discovered these realms. And then after that, you've got Arahant, fully enlightened, and then just no more in samsara. But yeah, let's say I change my mind. I really have to try to advocate that Sotapanna and Sakadagami are real. And the real Buddhist teaching and people really do reach this Aryan level. How would I explain it? Well, I'd explain it the way the texts say, which is pretty much what I was saying. although the texts are much more precise and haven't forgotten, exactly which states, like that each stage overcomes, that kind of thing. But I mean, I'd advocate it by saying, well, like I already said, I mean, it's like all these great Buddhist sages have believed it. The Buddha himself is recorded as having said it and taught it and advocated it. So who am I to be skeptical? So that's about the best I can do. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Gnostic Rocker. And Gnostic Rocker says, is Theravada a mystical system, or is it an ascetic practice that can lead to mysticism? And were most of the monastics or Buddhist laymen you practiced with over the years mystics, dogmatists, rule followers, or something else? Well, that's actually kind of two questions, isn't it? So we're going to have like 4 questions out of this. I'm going to separate these. Okay. All right. So the first question, is Theravada a mystical system, or is it an ascetic practice that can lead to mysticism? Well, I think originally it was a mystical system and, of course, an ascetic practice that can lead to mystical experiences. But the whole philosophical setup of like the Atthakavagga is largely mystical, where it's just saying, don't believe anything, don't like cling to perceptions, don't even cling to like what you've seen and heard. That's just all, it's external. Even your own thoughts from the Buddhist point of view are external. They're, what's the term? Visiting adventitious, I think is the term. Incoming from outside. So, yeah, early Buddhism, before Theravada, pre-Theravada, would be a mystical system that had an ascetic practice that was designed to cultivate mysticism. But Theravada it's already like the post-mystical stage. Theravada, like in the text, sometimes it's called Vibhajavada, the doctrine of analysis, which is practically the opposite of mysticism. So Theravada, Orthodox Theravada, is, I don't know if the average Orthodox Theravada Buddhist even understands mysticism. I don't think the average Theravada Buddhist monk is a mystic. But I think I'm skipping to the next part of that question. So Theravada, let's just forget like what Buddhism originally was, or like, the Atthakavagga, even though it's contained in the Theravada Tipitaka. Theravada has this text called the Maha Nidesa, which just reinterprets the Atthakavagga into something more doctrinal for Theravada. So the Atthakavagga is one of the few texts in the Pali Tipitaka that has a commentary that's so ancient that it's also canonical. And there was a felt need for this kind of commentary early on because Theravada was diverging from the teachings of the Atthakavagga. The Atthakavagga was too well known to edit out of the canon, and so they had to reinterpret it by doing a lot of stretching and twisting. And unless you're just a complete dogmatist with absolute faith, then it's pretty questionable, some of the interpretations in the Atthakavagga. So anyways, Theravada is not really a mystical system anymore. I mean, it can lead to mysticism almost inadvertently. I mean, second jhana, I would say starting with second jhana, you're getting into mystical states because you're wide awake and not thinking anything. So, yeah, it can lead to mysticism while itself not having a particularly mystical philosophy because it had abandoned the no perception, no view, don't believe anything attitude of the Atthakavagga, and they just came up with this huge scholastic edifice of doctrines and the doctrine of analysis, where you divide everything up into all its parts and you analyze all the causes and conditions. You single them out and try to understand how they interact in all this, which is practically the opposite of mysticism. So the second part of the question is, and were most of the monastics or Buddhist laymen you practiced with over the years mystics, dogmatists, rule followers, or something else? Very few mystics. Very few. Most of them, I mean, the Burmese are just like preeminent dogmatists. That even the scholars, like a Burmese monastic scholar, they can just be phenomenal with regard to their memory. They just master the text. They know what the texts say forwards and backwards. They have almost no independent thought. They don't dare to question any of it. They're like medieval Catholic theologians. You know, it's like they cannot question any of it. It's all true. So they just master what the book says. So they're definitely dogmatists. They're way better at dogmatizing than at rule following, because most Theravada Buddhist monks don't follow the rules very well. Very few Theravada Buddhist monks, maybe 2%, especially in Burma, will actually try to follow the rules of monastic discipline correctly. So yeah, dogmatists would probably be the best answer for that one. Although in Thailand, they tend to be a little bit less dogmatic, a little bit more into following rules, possibly even a little more mystical. Although they don't meditate as much in Thailand as they do in Burma, or so I've been led to understand. But you get into the meditation masters are going to be more mystical. The more advanced you get, the more mystical you get. That's just the way it works. And it works that way not just for Buddhism, but like I was saying, Christianity, Hinduism, whatever, the more advanced you get, and the more you just converge in mysticism. So I'm just going to move on to Gnostic Rocker's next question here, which is, what were your most beatific, meaningful experiences as a monastic? It would have to be like in that period between 1999 and 2004, when my meditation was at its zenith, so to speak. And I don't really want to go into a lot of recounting these experiences, but what should I mention? I mean, just I think it was the previous Q&A, I was saying that, you know, you get into one of this expansive, crystal clear meditative states where, I mean, the thoughts have just stopped. You know, every once in a while, a thought will start to arise. You'll see this sort of like little ripples starting to appear on the surface of a pond, and then you're aware of it immediately, and it just calms back out again. It just flattens back out, and your mind remains silent. So there's like a few initial movements of a thought trying to start to arise. You just see it immediately, and it just flattens back out again. Crystal clarity, silence, just expansive consciousness. And you have no doubt at all that 5 minutes of that is worth 15 years of struggling and floundering, and just it's better than 15 years of breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. And then there was the experience I had, like going down the stone steps in the rain, having like gut cramps from something I ate earlier that day. That I won't go into the details, but I remember talking about that once at some Dharma hall or just public talk in America. And some new age guy came up to me afterwards and says, "You were describing an enlightenment experience." He was really impressed by that, of the story of me going down the steps in the rain with gut cramps. And it was like, my meditation was was really good at the time. And just spontaneous mindfulness. You know, it's like down at the well, getting a bucket of water. You're just aware of, you know, the feeling of the rope against your hands, and the tightening of the muscles, and the breeze on your skin. It's like this heightened state of awareness. And then going down the stairs, it was like I just reached this point where I just like transcended the being rained on and just being doubled over with abdominal cramps from eating like spoiled shrimp curry or something. And it was just like the center of my consciousness, so to speak, was like deep down, just below the surface. And up at the surface, you have all these waves of gut cramps and being rained on and so forth. But where like the center of my consciousness was just stillness. You know, it was all fine. It's just like commotion up there, up at the surface that didn't even matter. And I mean, it was such an intense experience. I was almost weeping with joy and gratitude. While at the same time, anyone who saw me would think that I was dying, because I was still like doubled over, grimacing in pain from the stomach cramps and being rained on. So yeah, the most beatific, meaningful experiences as a monastic. I mean, I might get rid of meaningful because, of course, meaning is delusion. But the most beatific experiences as a monastic were like when my meditation was at its best, which is kind of should not be too surprising. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, also from Gnostic Rocker, which is as follows. I think someone should release a compilation of biblical teachings that are potentially at least Buddhist or Greco-Roman pagan in essence. I wonder, how would a Buddhist read or interpret the following from Corinthians? Quote, this is Paul of Tarsus speaking. Quote, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known." Unquote. Well, seeing through a glass darkly, yeah, that's kind of delusion or ignorance. I think a Buddhist wouldn't be saying that when you become enlightened, then you see face to face. Because, I mean, the faces are just part of the papancha, or kind of the delusion-fueled differentiation of the world into this and that. You know, just separating things and like considering different aspects of what you've separated as real entities. But yeah, so I wouldn't say it's completely a Buddhist statement. But I mean, the part about seeing through a glass darkly, yeah, I mean, that's a Buddhist statement. You can say that, or a Hindu statement. You know, they believe in Maya or illusion, that kind of thing. So, yeah, see, I wonder, how would a Buddhist read or interpret the following from Corinthians? Okay, yeah, seeing through the glass darkly, it's a metaphor. I mean, a Buddhist would interpret it somewhat differently. It's like, I mean, you're seeing clearly and then just sort of like cluttering up what you've seen with like perceptual interpretations, which then obscure the view. So, yeah, then face to face would be like when you're enlightened, you're no longer obscuring the view with all these perceptual symbolic interpretations. Now I know in part, but then I shall know, even as also I am known. Yeah, that could be like, now I'm ignorant, but after I become enlightened, then I'll know the truth, that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, for the most part, it could be interpreted in a Buddhist sense. But I think like a compilation of biblical teachings that are Buddhist would be different from a compilation of biblical teachings that are Greco-Roman pagan. Since a lot of the Bible teachings really are Greco-Roman pagan, like in the beginning was the Word, and you know, I mean, that's Greco-Roman pagan right there. That's like Neoplatonism that got converted into Christianity. But that wouldn't really be Buddhist, but it would be Greco-Roman pagan. I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And we are kind of getting sort of down towards the bottom, sort of. See, we've been going for, yes, it'll be less than 3 hours. So that's relatively short, I guess. So, next question is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, "Are devout lay Buddhists walking contradictions? I struggle to understand the idea of really believing Buddhism seriously and still not taking it to its logical conclusion, which is to become a bhikkhu." Well, when I read this, when I was compiling the list, I immediately thought of Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer taught a philosophy similar to Buddhism, as he himself admitted, but also he himself admitted to not being able to live up to the ideals of his own philosophy. Because, I mean, that was one of the main arguments against Schopenhauer, is he's talking about saintly renunciation and so forth when he was still a relatively worldly person. But, I mean, that's not necessarily being a hypocrite. It's just that he was able to see like a spiritual path that he knew he wasn't advanced enough to follow yet. I mean, you can read a text and that says, don't be angry. And you can agree with that. Sure, being angry is unskillful. It's bad karma. But still, you're going to be angry just because you still have human nature. So, I mean, it's not necessarily a walking contradiction. I was told so many times when I was in Burma that a lot of like Burmese lay people would come up to me and they'd say how much they respected me because I came from a foreign country that wasn't a Buddhist country. I came halfway around the world to practice Buddhism at a higher level than they were able to practice. It's like Buddhist lay people. It's like, yeah, they know that monks are supposed to renounce the world and all that, but they just can't bring themselves to do it just because their attachments are too strong or whatever it is. Like Schopenhauer, he came up with a relatively wise philosophy, and he just flat out admitted that he wasn't wise enough, at least in his practice. Now, he wasn't free enough of defilements to live up to the exaltation of his own philosophy. And that's fine. I mean, just even a monk, even if you're a monk, you still haven't reached the logical conclusion of Dhamma, which is don't have greed, hate, or delusion. It's like even a monk is often struggling, if he's a conscientious monk, to free himself of greed, hate, and delusion, and most monks fail. We're just stuck being human. No matter what you do, there you are, you're still human. And some humans have stronger passions, stronger attachments than others. So you can acknowledge that something is true and still not be able to follow it. You can acknowledge that you're better off never feeling anger, and still you're going to get angry sometimes. Because you're human. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's next question, which is a difficult one. Who is the most spiritually advanced Theravada lay Buddhist you have ever met? And I have no idea. I have no clue. Partly because in order to know how spiritually advanced somebody is, you got to see them at their worst. You got to see them when everything's going wrong. You got to see them when they're triggered, or see if they're just immune to being triggered. And as a monk, for example, I mean, you're seeing people on their best behavior. They're not going to be like beating their kids or screaming at their wife in front of you. So I really can't say who the most spiritually advanced Theravada lay Buddhist is that I have ever met. I've met a few wise ones in America, like American ones. I'm not going to name any names. I don't want them to get like conceited or anything, which might then just ruin their status as one of the most spiritually advanced Theravada lay Buddhists I've ever met. It could be that the most spiritually advanced Theravada lay Buddhist that I've ever met had been a monk for several years before they disrobed and became a lay Buddhist. Yeah, that's possible. But again, I really shouldn't name names with regard to that. And still, it's just really hard to say how spiritually advanced somebody is if you haven't like seen them under the worst circumstances when most people would be losing their shit. So I guess I answered that because I really can't answer the question, because I really can't say I don't know. So the next question is, what did their lay practice consist of? Well, if they were Burmese Buddhists, they kept 5 precepts and meditated daily. And I mean, some of them were celibate. Gosh, what did their lay practice consist of? It'd be like the typical devout lay Buddhist practice in Burma. They'd attend meditation retreats sometimes. They do their malas, their Buddhist rosaries a lot, that kind of thing. It'd be like kind of like medieval Roman Catholic Europeans. But the wisest Theravada lay people that I have come across, as a general rule, they keep 5 precepts and meditate. But I mean, really, it's hard to say, because as a monk meeting with lay people, then, I mean, you're not seeing their usual daily life. Again, you're just seeing them on their best behavior at a monastery. So it's really hard to say. But the standard devout lay Buddhist practice of Burma: keep 5 precepts, meditate daily, offer food to the monks, that kind of thing. Donate to the monasteries to, like, within your means. If you can afford it, you can offer a meditation cabin or something at a monastery, that kind of thing. The men would generally become donlabas, or temporary monks, from time to time. There's one old fellow, he was one of my main supporters in Burma. He'd been a donlaba monk like dozens of times probably over the course of his life. He built this building in his backyard just for monks to stay when they came to Rangoon on business, that sort of thing. So it's pretty basic. It's just standard, the lay duties of a Theravada Buddhist in Burma anyway. In America, it's probably a little more variable and eclectic. But those are tough questions because it's hard to say. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is kind of a semi-question. This is from Priapistic Monk. And the semi-question is about conceit, I guess. And he says, the conceit of I am comes from clinging to one, two, several, or all of the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, fabrication, consciousness. So instead of I and you or other, it's just cause and effect in regards to mind-made phenomena. There is no self here in these 5 aggregates. There is no self there, you, in the 5 aggregates. A deva once asked the Buddha about this: would an awakened one still say words like I and you? The Buddha said they would, knowing full well that they are conventions of speech and would be able to see the ultimate truth behind them. So then Priapistic Monk is quoting a sutta. And first, a deva, a small g god, superhuman being, says, he who's an arahant, his work achieved, free from taints, in final body clad, that monk might still use such words as I, still perchance might say, they call this mine. Would such a monk be prone to vain conceits? Then the Buddha says, bonds are gone for him without conceits. All delusion's chains are cast aside. Truly wise, he's gone beyond such thoughts. That monk still might use such words as I, still perchance might say, they call this mine. Well aware of common worldly speech, he would speak conforming to such use. And then that's the end of the sutta. And then Priapistic Monk says, no question per se, just wondering if your take on the consistent conceit phrase holds true. So the consistent conceit phrase, I'm not exactly sure what exactly that is. It's like the deva is asking, would such a monk be prone to vain conceits, because he's using words like I and me and you. And then the Buddha says, he would speak conforming to such you. No, wait. I guess there's no vain. Bonds are gone for him without conceits. And the Pali word that is translated as conceit is mana. And mana literally means measuring. Generally, like measuring yourself up against others. And in the Atthakavagga, it says that to consider yourself superior to others is mana or conceit. To consider yourself to be equal to others is mana or conceit. And to consider yourself to be inferior to others is mana or conceit. So any kind of self-regard would be mana. At least going with the context of that sutta in the Atthakavagga. So bonds are gone for him without conceits. It's like he no longer has self-view. He's no longer like creating contrast between himself and some external entity or phenomena. So, yeah, I mean, that's sort of what's creating samsara. It's like the basic delusion is I am, from a Buddhist point of view. That is the root of all delusion and suffering, is just the idea, the belief, I am. And that is conceit. Because you really have to like compare yourself with something that isn't yourself in order for yourself to have meaning. Arguably. I think some people could take issue with that, especially if they're like pantheists or something, that just kind of like a Hindu who considers the self to just be everything, you know, just the absolute God everywhere. But let's see. No question per se, just wondering if your take on the consistent conceit phrase holds true. Yeah, I don't really fully understand this semi-question, to tell you the truth. Gosh. But like an enlightened being, it's like I've said, you know, they can still like empirically appear to be having thoughts, appear to be having beliefs even, and they'll be saying words like I and me and you and yours and us and you know, that person and this person, you know, they still use language like that. It's just that they have transcended it. You know, they're no longer considering it to be ultimately real. You know, it's like their mind presumably is aware of ultimate reality, and this is just kind of like a puppet show going on. And because, you know, they're somewhat inhabiting one of the puppets, you know, it's sort of like in the Zhuangzi, which is a Chinese Taoist text. It says the sage conducts himself as a man because he was born into the body of a man. I mean, that's just what you do. I mean, so even if you're enlightened, I mean, you're still using worldly language because you have to use worldly language to communicate, but still it doesn't mean that you're taking it seriously and believing it as some kind of ultimate truth, because you've just gone beyond that. You know, it's still in the picture. It's just not the main point of the picture anymore. It's just kind of like a superficial kind of a thing that is largely irrelevant to like really reality. And I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, partly because I did not fully understand the last question. And this is from Yugu, who is our last questioner. And Yugu says, is it beneficial to be looking forward to state of enlightenment? And then he says, seeing this everyday mind struggle with samsaric problems. Okay, that's just sort of like a little commentary. So the question is it beneficial to be looking forward to the state of enlightenment? Well, ultimately, it's still delusional. I mean, like in the texts, the monk should not be aspiring to any existence, to this or that existence, not even the existence of being an enlightened sage. You know, it's like, be here now, attend to what is here now. Don't be worrying about the future. Don't be worrying about the past. Just be here now. Don't bother with what isn't here now, to the extent that you're able. So, I mean, it can be beneficial, even though it's like somewhat delusional and unskillful. I mean, it's like, just because something is somewhat immoral or unethical or delusional doesn't mean that it can't be helpful, because it may be that you're becoming less delusional. You know, it's like, let's say someone's really stingy. They don't want to share with anybody. And then finally one time they share kind of grudgingly. They kind of, you know, they kind of don't want to do it, but they force themselves to do it, and they kind of regret it afterwards. It's like, I should have just kept that. They're just going to fucking waste it or whatever. Still, even though that is like a delusional, attached, you know, kind of like defilement-laden action and attitude, still it was an improvement over just being completely stingy. At least they shared something, even though they didn't like doing it, and they were like like regretting it afterwards, still it was like a step in the right direction. Or like my father, you know, he had this past life regression before he was put into a hypnotic trance. You know, he had this objective. He wanted to know what was the point in his past lives that was pivotal in making him the person that he is today. And then he goes back into this hypnotic past life regression where he is an ancient soldier armed with a little sword like this, possibly a Roman. And his outfit, his troop, you know, his legion has been ordered to just exterminate every man, woman, and child in this barbarian village. And the barbarians had like long, kind of fair hair, possibly Germanic. So he's the soldier out there, he's obeying orders, and he's just killing people. He's massacring this village with his fellow soldiers until he gets this teenage boy. The boy is on his knees. He's got him by the hair. He's about ready to finish him off with his sword. And then he realizes that this boy isn't struggling and screaming and fighting and trying to get away like all the rest of them, that has just given up. He just has this world of sadness in his eyes. He's not even trying to defend himself. You know, it's just this, he's just overwhelmed with sorrow. And my father, this ancient soldier, feels compassion for him. He feels sorry for the kid. And so he just like lets go of him and just kind of pushes him and like points to the forest, you know, just goes like this, you know, just go. And so the kid kind of like snaps out of this daze, realizes that he has a chance, and just takes off running. And then my father says after that, he's had like feelings of like he had failed in his duty. He actually went out looking for that kid in order to kill him, but he couldn't find him because the kid was long gone. But that was like the first opening of his heart, you know, the first stirrings of the heart chakra in his spiritual evolution, at least according to him. So the whole point of what I'm saying is that, I mean, it wasn't particularly virtuous. I mean, he wasn't being saintly or anything, but still it was a step in that direction. Maybe a baby step towards being somewhat less, you know, delusional and full of defilements and so forth. So from that point of view, it can be beneficial to look forward to the state of enlightenment, you know, just kind of have that as an ideal, you know, like be working towards that, you know, have that as like the horizon that you're working towards, that sort of thing. You know, that can work. That can be a skillful means, even though ultimately you'd be better off just being here right now in the present moment, preferably not believing anything, you know, just being like in this state of like Atakawaga style, like mystical, I don't know what you call it, practically like solipsism, but it's not even solipsism. It's just, you're just like a pane of glass, and phenomena are just like going through you and with no obstruction. But it can be beneficial to look forward to the state of enlightenment, at least if you're considering that to be a worthy ideal that you're working towards. Then, I mean, ultimately you have to let it go, the looking forwards part. So it can be beneficial, it can help you, even though ultimately it's not an enlightened state. Because an enlightened being has no aspirations to any kind of existence, any kind of future existence, no aspiration whatsoever. So I'm just going to move on to Yuga U's next question, which is the last question of this Q&A. And Yuga U says, what did Buddha mean by that there is some perception in an enlightened mind? You mentioned this in your last video, kind of a Zen koan. Yeah, okay, so that's, again, referring to the video I did just recently on the Kalaha Viwada Sutta. And I've already discussed this probably 2 or 3 times over the course of this video, how you have perception, like an enlightened being, just empirically. You know, you could look at an enlightened being, or you do a brain scan on an enlightened being, and you're going to find like activity in there. I mean, they're not going to be just completely empty. Their mind is not going to be like silent and just like total mystical union and rapture. They're still going to have to be carrying out conversations and so forth. But I'm assuming it could be that they really are. It's just nothing going on in there, that they're just like this, like a reflection. Like Ram Dass used to say about Maharaji, that the better you got to know him, the more you realize that there was nobody there, that he was just like a mirror reflecting your own karma back at you. So at some level, an enlightened being may be like that, but going with this koan-like verse in the Kalahaviwara Sutta, like the enlightened being, his mental state is such that he has no perception of perception, he has no perception of non-perception, he is not without perception, and he has no perception of void. So for one who has become thus, form becomes void, etc., etc. So, I mean, that is pretty obviously the Buddha in this text is describing the mental states of an enlightened being. He has no perception of perception. He has no perception of non-perception. He is not without perception. He has no perception of void, which would seem to rule out all possibilities. So it's a kind of paradox. But I think the paradox is explained by the fact, like I've already been saying in this video, that there is a kind of perception, but it's just that he is not seeing it at the level of perception, the enlightened being. He has like transcended the illusion or the meaning of this perception. It's just nature taking its course. But it's like, again, if you say that consciousness is water and mental states like perceptions are the waves on the surface of the water, the enlightened being still might have the waves. It's just that he's seeing it all as water. It's like, is this ceramic or is this cup? Well, it's both. The ceramic is the essence, the cup is the form or function. And so you can focus on one or the other. And the unenlightened person is focusing on function and form, whereas the enlightened being is dealing at the level of essence. I just hit the microphone with my hand while gesturing wildly. And again, it's like for people that they just have to think like intellectually, they have to understand and make sense of things intellectually in order for it to be useful to them, in order for it to be meaningful in any way. They're not going to get it, because you have to transcend the content of perception, the symbolic content of perception. It's sort of like a painting. Let's just say the Mona Lisa. It's a famous painting. So you can look at that and you see there's this, relatively upper class Italian woman of the Renaissance with this enigmatic smile and her eyebrows shaved off. Or you could look at it from the point of view of like some painter or even like a chemist, just analyzing the style, the painting style, how the brush strokes were made. You're not even really focusing on this woman. You're just dealing with like the elements. What kind of paint is used? What kind of pigments are in the paint? It's like that sort of thing. You just kind of deconstruct it into this assemblage of canvas and like oil paints with pigments in them. It's like, what is it? What kind of oil is paint? It's the same stuff linoleum was made out of. Gosh. Flaxseed. I don't. It's escaping me. But anyways, you can look at that painting from that level of just sort of like the essence of it, and just completely ignore that. It's like the Renaissance Italian lady with the enigmatic smile and no eyebrows. So, it's still, you could say that the perception is still there, but you could even look at perceptions. Like you have this belief. You can just identify with the belief and that's your reality, in which case it's a samsaric existence. Or you can just examine the mental state as it arises, and, it's not you. It's just this mental state arising, and you can just sort of analyze, or not even analyze, but just observe it, just like with detachment, and then not attribute any kind of real like symbolic meaning to it. And then that would be a more enlightened way of looking at it. And that's like the enlightened, like, answer to the paradox of, he has no perception of perception, no perception of non-perception, but he's also not without perception. So there is perception there, but it's just sort of like this transcended perception. Like, the symbolic meaning is no longer really the point of it. It's no longer believed in as some kind of reality. It's just nature taking its course because brains generate perceptions, at least in this version of samsara. And I mean, I can answer the same question over and over and over and over again. But for people, I mean, I'm not saying that Yuga-U is like this, but for people that really are just like addicted to thinking, they just identify the world through their intellectual interpretation, just through their mental states. They really have no experience extending beyond this self-contained, like, artificial world of symbols. So they consider that to be reality, and that, or even if they acknowledge that they're not fully enlightened, still they think that somehow enlightenment is going to occur within the context of this body of symbols, these mental symbols. And it just doesn't work like that. It's like you have to escape from the prison. And after you escape from the prison, or Plato's cave, you have to escape from Plato's cave. After you escape, you can come back in again. It's going to be a completely different experience because you're not going to be chained up looking at the wall anymore. You can still see the reflections on the wall, but you see them for what they are. They're just shadows flickering on a wall. But even that is not going far enough in an attempt to try to explain an enlightened being and his attitude. I mean, it's still there. It's just kind of empty. It's just, it's hard to explain. You can't really even explain it. The Buddha himself couldn't really explain it. So, yeah, it's just that the perceptions are there. It's just that they are transcended and are no longer the center of your attention. That you're looking past the waves and just seeing water, so to speak. So I guess I'm done. I really guess that I'm really done. And so, like I should always say at the beginning, never do, except once. If you think I can answer a question, especially about Dharma, early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, meditation, that sort of thing, other realms, biology, Western philosophy, to some degree, like Western classical literature, that kind of thing, I might be able to answer. Then again, I might not. And so no more than 3 questions per person per episode, please. And like and subscribe if you liked this and would like to see more. And be happy. And now I'm going to push this button that is going to cause me to stop recording.